it's a 20% increase. It's like, well, yeah, but you can't compare that 20% to a 20% back here. Imagine if COVID came when the life expectancy was 65. It'd be nothing. It'd be a blip, because how many...
And no one said that.
Because
no one's drawn attention
not
to
that I've heard.
It's weird. It's almost like, what is the... I'd be interested to know the theory for how we've ended up with an actual set of policies that have been... You couldn't have written a less effective set of policies to minimise harm in the last 12 months.
This is the Panopticast. Conversations at the edge of freedom.
In the news around Republican and Democrat. So it's kind of, it's not that that's necessarily been used to close down freedom of speech in that respect. It's just an observation that, you know, even for example in the Congress, there's less cooperation, you know, if you're a blue or red, and out in society, it becomes more of a divider, so that, you know, you'll get people that are, you know, they've done surveys, they're less likely to, or they're more likely to be unhappy if the daughter marries someone of the other political persuasion or whatever. So there's that kind of polarisation that's happening, where particular issues or particular agendas are essentially driving a wedge to the extent that you're either with us or against us, and it's becoming an in-group and an out-group.
Yeah.
I think it's at the it's in certain areas and at the extremes of that then becomes, you know, once you get the sort of in-group and out-group, there's always a risk that then, you know, it's like, to take an extreme example, it's like that's where, you know, these things end in genocide, don't they? When you get the really extreme in-groups and out-groups, whereby your identity and the way in which you're constructed through these discourses that are polarising and how you come to sort of embody those, the opposing group becomes such a sort of existential threat to you, your ideas, your beliefs, your persona, your identity, etc. That then it's not that we're in some kind of agonistic interchange and debate or engagement with this group that have opposing views in a sort of in a political forum where we accept winning and losing. You know, what starts to happen is that actually it becomes an existential threat, and then at that point you're willing to try and at the very least shut down the opposing side. And I think at that point it becomes sort of important to freedom of speech, because, you know, those who temporarily win power, or those agendas, you know, not just political power but power, you know, cultural power or whatever, they then take that opportunity to actually start, you know, attacking in a more kind of bellicose, warlike sense those others that don't. And then I guess the other area, you know, that we're interested in is when that's being used to further, you know, power in a more traditional sense. So whether that's kind of geopolitical power or state power or whatever, whereby that whole climate is then used, as it is being doing at the moment, to kind of clamp down on dissenting voices across a range of issues, the overall effect of which is basically to reduce the space for kind of dissent and contest. And that's the big worrying thing from a freedom perspective and from a freedom of speech perspective.
I'm seeing the freedom of speech thing as being fundamental. And the way I was talking about before, like, as being, it's above everything, because what freedom of speech amounts to is your capacity to cast a verbal vote on your version of reality. And I believe we're all kind of operating in a constantly evolving democracy of projected realities. Even in the most mundane way, that's just, here's my myth, here's my viewpoint, here's how I see the world. Everyone bounces them off each other, and then there's smaller and larger consensuses moving out. So your capacity to speak freely, and especially given the fact that the realities that are produced are arguably, if you restrict someone from being able to conceptualize certain things, if a large enough group of people create a trend via their vote, their reality vote, if you like, you could end up a generation later having people not even being able to conceptualize the things that people could conceptualize previously. So your power to speak, to freedom of speech, isn't even a big deal in the sense of the way the founding fathers or whoever else would have just said this is concrete, this is a really big thing. It's bigger than that, because on a reality creation sense, even in art, moving across every sphere, your capacity to speak is your capacity to cast your vote in the consensus reality. If you don't, you've been nullified as a human being. So that when you put it in those terms, it seems like it's all grand and epic and it's bigger than everything. It's like, well, that's my core way of operating as a human being. But then if you put that over there, polarization is no smaller in the sense that it's as primal. There's arguably nothing more primal than mine and the other. The identification of something that's in my interests and outside my interests, or in keeping with my current, in resonance with me, whether it's mentally or culturally, or just in a safety sense, what is going to be in resonance with me and is something that I can include, and what is the thing that wants to be on the outside of that. So there's polarization in the negative sense of it being utilized as a political tactic, but there's I don't want to say healthy, but there's a perfectly natural way that we distinguish into different groups, and it's like that can be managed, stage managed even, to as a sort of as a political ploy. I mean, it's the trope of divide to rule, but it's kind of like divide to rule puts a name on that. That's the basis of the political expression of what we're talking about in polarization being used that way. But there's a level behind it operating in sort of psychology. Like I can't remember when we talked about it, but
Jonathan Haidt.
That's it. Yeah. Jonathan Haidt, not Happiness Hypothesis, the other one. With people like him, you're identifying the degree to which a lot of it's bullshit, and that people believe these are my viewpoints that I'm expressing, when really they're just parroting the larger number of the people in their immediate environment have been saying themselves, which we've all been victims to that. We all have that. We all make that observation at some point where you look around and go, is it just a coincidence that the sum of my viewpoints is roughly and the average mean of the 20 people I've got the most respect for? And chicken or egg, do I surround myself with those people for that reason or whatever? But there's definitely some correlation. You choose your environment and it seems to govern exactly where you sort of go, which I kind of almost lean towards your core free will being to choose your environment sensibly, because you're just going to program yourself with it without even realising, subconsciously or otherwise. So they're both, whether it's you can't really say, polarization is the key thing, or the freedom of speech thing's the key thing, because they're both too big, they're too huge on their own. But they're the main reason that we're mobilized. I think it's the initial thing of that line, defending that line, where at one point you knew there was a line that at which you wouldn't go back from, where you will speak your truth at this point, and I'm unashamedly and without being worried for your safety. And then in the last year with COVID, etc., you're looking down the line, and the line's eradicated. I've got 20 or 30 people in that line, whereas previously everyone I knew was on that line. So now it might be worth, when you find yourself with less people on that line, either making more noise or making more efficient noise, or at least trying to communicate with people and trying to encourage people to either get back on that line, or at least discuss the issues about why you might want to choose where that line is.
There's the thing around this post-truth sort of scenario, the line that I like from McKenna, the balkanization of epistemology. So people sort of speaking their truths, and there being actually no ground on which there's a way to not necessarily reconcile, but there's no common ground even within which people can be interpreted and understood. And I think, and that's an effect, I think, of polarization, to the extent to which either the outgroup is totally misunderstood, or just some kind of like axiomatic grounding assumptions are so different. I guess that's the thing around going down to the level of epistemology, rather than just saying a difference in beliefs or a difference in views, whereby people in group X cannot even understand the ground upon which people in group Y stand, and therefore the gulf between them is massive. And I think under those circumstances, freedom of speech becomes under threat, because part of the thing, I was just kind of doodling the thing, but there has to be a kind of public fora, or kind of the space in which issues are worked through, the space in which some form of kind of, again, not consensus, but some kind of way of working through and making decisions that people can kind of accept. And at the point at which there's that kind of balkanization of epistemology, at the point at which there's just not a shared reality on which people can,
it's literally alternate realities.
Yeah, literally alternate realities on which people, so there's no even basis for a conversation and for an exchange of kind of,
or even incentive,
on things.
Even incentive at that point, you're a different species, almost a different species, a different,
yeah,
you might as well be
living in a different world. There's
like
no
a complete,
shared way of operationalising
complete
those.
reordering of values and prioritization of
Yeah.
values, and that's what what's going to have a more powerful effect on differentiating one group from another than having a reordering of the entire value system.
Yeah, and so then in terms of like speak your truth, like you said that, and it's like, in a way, I want to be able to sort of speak my ambivalence, or speak, maybe ambivalence is the wrong word, but speak my kind of inquiry or concern or whatever, without fear of sort of censure, without fear of being, of the interpretation in the other person's head, because that, that's the other thing that happens around polarization. I think it, there's also some kind of relationship between sort of polarization and stereotyping, in that it's about reducing complexity to simplicity and boxing it off in a particular way. So if someone expresses some doubt about a particular subject or something, like, COVID's the kind of current issue, isn't it? If someone, for example, questions the way in which the government is measuring, or the institutions that have been set up to measure whether something is or is not a COVID death, to even question that, it's becoming more and more likely that you're there, you're in the COVID denier group, and so any nuance,
certain at this point.
Yeah, so any nuance around that becomes like being okay. So you're here, or you kind of here, and if you're here, then the people here are going to push you into there, and if you're here, then the people here are going to push you into there. So that's really chilling, in terms of, so it might not be necessarily an explicit prohibition on freedom of speech, although there's plenty of that going on.
Self-restraint.
It becomes self-censorship, because you are concerned that to express a particular view, or not even a view, to raise a particular question even, is going to, in the sort of public discourse, confer interpretations in the audience's mind that you are a this or a that.
There's another kind of self-censorship as well that I definitely find myself doing, and that's the self-censorship based on trying to maximize your sphere of influence. So like I was saying before about the free speech, casting my reality vote, the degree to which what I'm saying is credible or is taken as credible by, and I don't just mean if I'm having a conversation with a peer and we're just mashing out, that's one thing. But if you're speaking in a public place with 7 or 8 people and you want it to be effective, you're trying to get across an idea, then you have to police yourself in order to maintain the maximum efficacy and not get shut down.
You're taking an audience-centric view, in a sense that I have to try and understand what the audience thinks, so that I know what I would say and how it will
and just knowing
them.
That
therefore I'm not going to say something, even if I believe it, that they will think is crazy because they've not, or they will think, in a particular way, or they will think that they would badge you as something.
Yeah, well, that's it. As soon as you say one thing, you lose. That's right. You register a certain amount of influence initially, and you know that there's a specific list of 10 words you could figure out in 10 minutes now, that if you say any of those words or allude to any of those things, it's too much of a trigger with people, and instantly your reputation's been damaged. It's changing the available range of dialogue, limiting it down and restricting it as soon as people are playing those games. And I think what it does with me, and it's a long time ago when I noticed I was doing that, and I thought, right, I'm modifying the way I interact with my environment culturally. And I am no longer just honestly expressing myself. I'm trying to be effective, or I'm at least trying to balance those things, depending on the person. It'd be full authenticity sometimes, and then sometimes being a bit more prudent. And so, and it's pre-COVID that I was doing that, obviously, but that even more so now, so that everyone's playing this poker game, like of trying to maintain the most amount of influence they can, because the ecology, the information ecology, is so corrupt. You've got no right to spend your merit. You know, if you've got a level of influence within a certain arena, you could almost argue that it's not shameful, but it's almost immoral for you to just squander that reputation that you've got, when you might be able to get this, what you perceive as quality data, into a corrupted ecosystem and try and redress the balance a little bit, according to your own view, which could be completely bullshit, obviously.
And there's also, I mean, probably in that mix, it's not just about efficacy, but it's also about kind of, social etiquette's not quite the right word, but
not being a dick arguing about politics.
Not being a dick and not saying things that you know are going to kind of alienate people or make people,
Exactly.
so...
Increasing polarisation.
Yeah, so you want to kind of, you want to ingratiate yourself. I mean, it's partly about influence, but I don't think it's in a sort of purely kind of, Machiavellian sort of logic. I think it's also got a very sort of social aspect to it.
An evolved
that you want to relate.
Almost familial.
You want to relate to someone, don't you? So
and
if
connect,
you start, connect
and not
and relate.
offend.
Yeah.
In the same way that when you had when you look at Facebook, and you look at we've all done the holy shit, look at this shit fight that this thread's turned into, or even any Reddit, whatever. And then, we've all had that observation where
I've
you
never
think
been on Facebook, but
you remain the single person I've ever met. I don't know how you've done it. It's a hell of a trophy. But if you always know when you look at that, you could get any two of those people. I mean, some people are just dicks, fair enough, but 9 times out of 10, you could get the two people that are really crossing swords loudly, get them eye to eye, get them face to face in a room, and all that disappears out the window, because you get all the things we've evolved with, the eye contact and the even just the proximal familiarity, all those human elements that kick in, and instantly your agenda, subconscious as well as conscious, is to connect with this person, is to not upset this person, even on a really cynical sense of I don't want to be in a physical altercation with this person. It gets as primitive as that, but even just on the level of connecting, establishing meaningful relationships with people. So you're in a room, you have all those triggers firing, and you're going to make every effort. On Facebook or wherever else, all those things are disengaged, and everything pushes you towards scoring those ego points. I'm smarter than you. I just outclassed you in this particular debate.
But then, as a result of that, increased sort of time spent in these mediated realities, and there's social media, and then there's traditional media, and there's the realities that are being created in those spaces. I think there's then that's creating a particular environment or a particular baseline for interpersonal interaction, and specifically to what we're talking about, and like in terms of sort of motivation for me, to the extent whereby I agree with exactly what you've said. Usually all those things melt away really in interpersonal exchange, because you build some rapport. You usually kind of are open to kind of some form of pushback without it turning into some kind of you've been owned or whatever, the kind of dynamic that happens there. And as a result of that, kind of trust builds. And even if someone has a view that you feel is wayward, you feel is unusual, etc., you don't react to that in a particular way. But now I think there's a sense with which there's an increase in taboos, because one of the effects of the kind of polarization is maybe that person's that sounds like something I've been told's a far right trope, or that sounds like something I've been told's a far left trope, or that's something it's all getting classified. And there's a or just like you can't really you can't really say that whether because and it's kind of the Orwell thing in his introduction to Animal Farm that got actually ironically got removed by the publisher. It got censored.
I didn't know that.
And he was basically saying that I think it was to do with how censorship actually operates, and it got censored. And I think because he was writing about an allegory about a kind of communist totalitarian society, he wanted to kind of say, like, let's make no mistakes here, this stuff happens in in England as well, and in sort of purported free countries. He said, but it's not in the same form. It's usually that people know what can and can't be said in polite company, in polite conversation. And I think the way the extent to which that operates is kind of difficult to recognise. But what the polarisation does, I think, and not only the polarisation, but the kind of the power of dominant narratives, and we're probably just going to have to sort of use COVID as the sort of example, because we can start to sort of talk concretely about that, is that people get a little bit edgier because they've been told that certain type of thoughts are kind of not acceptable or are beyond the pale, or are associated with particular groups that they're not necessarily associated.
Well, that's enough, isn't it? Just that you become associated with like, do you want to be associated with and it's funny because I think everyone's biased either way. Like, most people will accept being pigeonholed as, let's not say a conspiracy theorist, but someone who believes what they're told. You don't the crew that don't believe everything they're told, or wear a badge as a badge of honour that I don't believe what the government tells me, versus the people who say generally you can trust the government, you can trust these structures. Like, those are the kind of the two, when you strip it down, that's what they are. And everyone is usually pretty comfortable in one of those groups. Not many people say, well, I don't like either of those. Whereas there is a margin. I mean, well, it's the second group, the group of not believing everything you're told, covers a very, very wide group of people with different viewpoints.
Yeah, but then there's a question as to why they feel comfortable in one or the other of those groups, and like, I mean, because there's an idea that like it was actually a guy called Zizek that I heard talking about it, but I thought it was really quite a sort of powerful idea, and I think he was talking about it in the context again of a sort of totalitarian society. He was talking about kind of communism because he grew up under a communist regime, but it was the big other, and basically he was saying that most people think that propaganda is effective through actually convincing people of particular beliefs. But he said actually, one of the things that it constructs, and I think I don't fully understand where he's coming from with it, but I think he's coming from a sort of psychoanalytical perspective, and like, but there is this thing called the big other, which is in a way kind of, I guess, a sort of synonym is authority, but it's a bit different to that. It's basically what everyone thinks the big other thinks, and the big other is this kind of, I guess, narrative or sort of discursive structure. And the example they used, which I thought was almost comic, you could almost do some kind of satire on it, was that, and obviously it's speculating here, but you can imagine how paranoid the Politburo was, for example. Stalin and his inner sort of generals and inner circle. Yeah, in response to the people. Whereby all they're saying is what they believe is acceptable to say, whether they believe it or not. And now everyone in that room could actually believe something differently, but if anyone deviated from what the big other believed, anyone else would be willing to kind of put them against the wall and shoot them. So you get this kind of structure, which isn't even just the aggregate of the beliefs of the people that are within it, but is something
aggregate of behaviour. Like not that they believe. It's not that they're necessarily. Am I following you right? That it's not necessarily that they've been programmed by this propaganda. It's that they recognise there's a structure and a system of rules by which they will prosper, just going along. So they don't believe it. That it's just not that they've been mind controlled. It's that they're just falling. They're falling in. Cleverly, they're just intelligently adapting to an environment rather than trying to overthrow a structure that's far more powerful than them.
Yeah, and also just the power of ideology. So I mean, another sort of simple way of putting it, I guess, is that there was certainly a certain point where no one believed, in Russia, no one believed in communism any longer, or at least in the way in which it was, the dominant way in which it was being, it manifests there. No one believed in it, individually or on aggregate, but everyone sort of referenced it because there was an assumption that other people did, almost, but they probably knew other people didn't.
But it validates, the thing is having that, and this is the core of that free speech line to be defended, I think. Like, if you stop, it's almost like the seemingly most benign level of restraining your speech, and this is kind of like never talk about politics and religion, kind of. You don't lean over a bar as a person working in that place and start discussing something that's going to divide people. Generally, the way basic etiquette.
Yeah.
But when you don't,
the rules of a landlord sort of thing.
Yeah, but by doing it, in any situation, like, what you're doing is you're strengthening the capacity for people to not do, when people, that whole fear of the big other thing, like when someone's going along. I watched that Malik film a couple of weeks ago, and I forget the name of it, A Hidden Life or Hidden Man, Hidden Life, I think. It's really good. It's really good. It's about that. I forget his name, but the Swiss conscientious objector.
Right.
So conscientious objector, when the Nazis are swooping through your village, might not be a smart move, but it's a really good kind of analysis of all this, where he's the one guy in the village saying, "Are you serious? What are we doing?" And everyone's, and it's this exactly this, like the demeanor isn't like these people being kind of fanatical Nazis. They're just going, "Shut the fuck up," and going along, right? Yeah. Well, let's say in that village, if that village had a kind of an inherent kind of culture of an anti-authoritarian kind of, culture of like, don't believe any of this shit or whatever, like when people, and it's very much like this round here, like Calder Valley's great for that, or it was. Ebden Bridge is definitely dropping off the radar, but like you've that mentality of assume it's all bollocks first kind of thing
until they convince you otherwise.
That's helpful because it slows that process down, like you, and in the same way as speaking, being very quick to just say, well, I don't mean any offence, mate, but I think that's all bollocks. Like, for people to be able to do that, and the other guy to be able to say, oh, well, fair enough. Like, as when what that means is you're constantly hearing votes cast for the alternate viewpoint, and it doesn't matter if you don't believe them. What it means is that then you're less likely to completely fall under that influence of the big other. When something's critical, you're doing you're running the program in your head and you're computing it and going, actually, I've heard a lot of different people saying a lot of very different things about this, and there's kind of it's a very sort of mixed bag about where people stand on it. If everyone's been keeping quiet, it's a lot easier for you to just say, oh shit, no one's with me on this. I need to go with where authority's pushing me on it. So it's an argument for being a dickhead. I don't even mean a troll, but it's an argument for
skeptic,
for being a skeptic, but also even a contrarian. Yeah, there's an argument for playing devil's advocate, and like I say this, I don't know whether I'm even right about this, but I've kind of, to a fault, sometimes someone will make I think it's if it's a firm stand, I feel like I have to do it, and it's kind of what I believe, but then I sometimes entertain the idea that I might be full of shit on that. And I'll switch out of my sort of dominant viewpoint, and I'll play the devil's advocate role quite hard, because I feel like just the exercise of that can be far more useful than two people just patting themselves on the back about what they believe.
So let's talk about COVID.
It's like, what's COVID?
We really need to talk about COVID. So like I was making some, like I was just jotting down words, like, and so ideology, closure, consensus, democracy, and traitor. So I think, like, once you get the kind of in-group, out-group mentality, then you get a notion of, you're almost being a traitor to a particular group, and therefore, you have to fall in line with the whole kit and caboodle. That, like, removes the nuance, it removes the ability to kind of... And then there's a relationship between, openness, which is, I think, kind of what, you were describing in a way, like, whether you're sort of, being the contrarian in order to kind of, when you use, I think you use the word when someone takes a firm line or whatever. Yeah, there's always
disturbingly firm.
Yeah, there's always a need to like wait a minute, this sounds like closing down something here. Like this is like, and then there's a relationship between that and ideology, because in a way, ideology is about closing closing things down to a particular set of beliefs, structures, ideas.
It's an exclusion of other
data.
Yeah,
Exactly. And it's like, no, everything, this captures everything, and this is the filter through which you need to interpret the world. So there's a relationship then between sort of democracy and openness, as opposed to a kind of ideology or closure, whereby and the whole point around dissenting voices, contrarian views, and so on. But then there's obviously also a kind of perceived negative relationship between that openness, democracy, lack of closure, anti-ideological, avoidance of sort of pure sort of in-group and out-groups, and this notion of traitor, and being able to respond to a crisis, because the argument is, well, in a crisis situation, what's required is decisive action, and all this debate and kind of contrarianism and dissenting views and so on. It's not going to enable the the conclusive action that we need to take. The kind of the decisive action.
Yeah, like the more the drama gets ramped up.
We need to take.
Yeah.
So and like to let's put this in the COVID context and some of the concerns that people have expressed around the fact that both in terms of the response itself, what's kind of somewhat euphemistically referred to as non-pharmaceutical interventions, is it NPIs or something like that? This is the language that
What is that?
That's like social distancing, lockdown,
Oh,
anything
course,
that's
right, okay,
non-medical, non-pharmaceutical. These non-pharmaceutical interventions has been dominant ones. Firstly, you've got a situation whereby, and this was articulated by a guy who was on stage, the guy who was the leading author, I think, of the first modelling by Imperial College, whose name always seems to elude me, but he did an interview where he was saying we didn't think we could get away with it in the West. We saw what they were doing in China, and then we saw they did it in Italy, and we thought maybe we can do. So and in a way that was the point that we can't do this in democracy. This is something.
So specifically, what was he getting away with? What was
He meant a lockdown. He meant lockdowns.
But like for the.
I need to remember his name because otherwise I'm not.
Purely like, but in believing, but it
Neil
is,
Ferguson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But his position being this is the best thing that we could do, but it's just that
we don't know if we
can get away with it.
We couldn't get away with it. But even in saying that, he's implicitly, if not explicitly, recognising that there is a conflict between what he believes is the right thing to do, and let's be good faith about it. Let's assume he does believe that's the best thing to do. And
the expectation of everybody else on what's the right thing to do.
But potentially, or reframing that, the values of a democratic society, basically, the values and the parameters of a democratic society, which in a way even should transcend what people are willing to accept or their expectations. You
can almost argue it transcends life and death, depending on scale.
Yeah, so you would in a way actually it's the blending of what we refer to as a liberal democracy, and without I'm not going to sort of defend that in general, but there's always been a fear that sort of democracy in a kind of crude sense could be essentially mob rule. If you get 51% of the people to do something, then they can screw over the 49%.
Tyranny of the mob.
Yeah, so the liberal injection has then also been to kind of say, wait a minute, there's also like human rights, and there are also kind of individual rights and civil liberties, which mean the dominant group cannot actually yes, they can they can drive the direction of travel, they can sort of certain policy areas, but there are some fundamental things that can't be impinged on, and that's the liberal injection into sort of democracy. And so essentially, what Neil Ferguson was saying, I think, is, they've done this in China. We think this is very effective as a non-pharmaceutical intervention around the pandemic, and we can bracket out the whole sort of scientific argument about that. But then, he recognised that, I thought that was incompatible with liberal democracies and the values of the people here. But then we saw them doing it in Italy, and we thought, maybe we can get away with this. But anyway, yeah, that relationship to sort of, and then what's come along with that then is that, okay, so now we're in a crisis situation, and I'm just going to put a bracket around the state of exception because that's something that we want to get to. But now we're in a crisis situation. Not only are we doing something in terms of what I should call accurately, let me think, I'm hesitant to call it legal because I think there's questions around whether what they've done is actually legal. But certainly that's what I'm looking for. Certainly, it's had the force of law. So the force behind the law, i.e., the police and the state, is visibly and explicitly being deployed in order to enforce the measures that have been the diktats in most cases that have been made through ministerial decree. And so not only are they doing that, that's one thing. So that's an imposition on the body, if you like. You must do this, you must do that. But then the extent to which that has then encroached on what it's legitimate to say and what people are able to say, and the general rationale for that has been that by people questioning, criticising, etc., the assumptions or the foundations or the measures that are being taken, that could undermine the likelihood that people will continue to follow those measures and believe in those assumptions and so on. And we recognise we can't actually police this, and we want people to consent, and the word consent is related to consensus. We have to make sure that the consensus is maintained, and therefore we can't have this kind of normal democratic process whereby contrarian, dissenting, etc. voices are able to battle it out in the way that you talked about in the start, in terms of that I can't remember how do you put it, sort of the ability to sort of
like competing narratives,
like
democracy of reality
whatever,
creation kind of thing. Yeah.
So that has to be suspended as well. So you get a situation in which the actual rule of law is suspended, the actual standard rights of citizens vis-a-vis the state, things that we just think are completely fundamental around the right of association, the right to protest. All these things are curtailed, if not outright banned. And at the same time, the sort of last stand, if you like, or the final stand, against that speech and the ability to express dissenting views, even if you're saying, look, I'm going to follow the laws that are being put in place, I'm going to sort of respect that, but I'm going to express, this is what I believe, this is what I dissent. That is then either shut down formally through different forms of censorship, and we can talk about what's happened on social media, or is shut down in the ways that we've been describing by a extremely powerful centre of narrative production, which is not only the government, but the government's broader influence across any institutional actor or organisation who doesn't want to sort of fall foul of that. And once that's embedded, then there's a sort of self-policing that then goes on between an organisational level, and then to a lesser extent, but certainly to a powerful extent, at an individual level. So, there's just so many organisations that simply couldn't step out of line with that, and if they were to express dissenting voices against that, would be penalised substantially. So what you then actually get is closure. You get ideology in the place of science, I think, predominantly. You don't get certainly what you get is that, in that Orwell sense that we mentioned around, what shouldn't be mentioned in polite society. Well, I think there's also those things that shouldn't be mentioned in polite journals, or in respected journals, whereby you hear stories that particular authors have tried to put forward things. They've not been rejected on pure merit, It's not about the rigour of it. It's that those that are dissenting are subject to much greater rigour or much more conclusivity than those that are that are essentially supporting the consensus narrative. And so consensus and nod to Chomsky, consent is constructed and to a certain extent sort of manufactured, and then then that puts a sort of big question mark over democracy. And to come, and I'll shut up now, but to come back to the freedom of speech thing, then it's basically then it's a form of closure at sort of multiple levels, the direct censorship and the sort of self-censorship, and that sense that you cannot walk into a room or cannot have certain conversations without the fear of being excommunicated, essentially,
Yeah, and you've got that
from the in-group.
Yeah, and you've got that this sort of 2 or 3 levels to there's the censorship, there's the censoring yourself, like you said before about someone speaking up and saying, look, I'll follow these laws or whatever, this is what the structure's forcing me to do, but I disagree with it, right? And that might seem meek, it might seem like, well, what's that doing? But it's doing a lot. It's keeping available the reality of an alternative, because to take it a step further, to sort of clarify that, imagine a world where the concepts of that alternative reality don't exist anymore, so that a generation from now, and this is an exaggeration, it sounds very Orwell and it sounds a bit dystopian, but whatever, a couple of generations from now, maybe 500 years, if at some point in the future people don't have the concepts by which to free themselves or to remain free or whatever, that can only come about by people not properly exercising those concepts previously. And I think that's, if not the most important thing, it's one of them, to guard that.
The other thing that I think people are concerned about that's not very well understood, and there's probably a few kind of isolated human rights lawyers speaking up, and maybe some civil liberties campaigning groups that are relatively speaking on the margins, but the idea of the state of exception and as the basis on which a lot of this happens, and the major concern.
Hang on, unpack state of exception for me anyway.
So, I mean, the basic idea is that in an exceptional situation or circumstance,
when the barbarians are at the gate,
exactly, that's the kind of origin that public law and public authorities are suspended in favour of military dictators provisionally for a brief period of time. So you don't want a legislative chamber, you don't want a kind of parliament or any other kind of deliberative, more accountable democratic structure deciding what happens, because it's too slow. And as you say, if you've got the barbarians at the door, what you need is decisive action. All those things are suspended, all rules are suspended, and in that case the military kind of autocrat, what they say goes, and the singular goal is to defeat the enemy, because it's an exceptional circumstance. When the exception's over, the assumption would be that it goes back to what it previously was. There are real states of exceptions and the fictitious states of exceptions, and actually, historically it evolved from a concept that was purely, war oriented, so the state of siege, to state of exceptions caused by, economic crises or even sort of civil unrest, internally. So.
But if that
from the populace,
if any system, if any social structure incorporates the allowance for the state, for that concept to exist, for the state of exception to exist, in fact, this is what he's saying, isn't it? That it's not democratic. Like if that's always there to be summoned up with limited justification, with any justification, then you can't call it democracy. And that's didn't he go towards that?
Certainly what's happened, and certainly what he is pointing to, in a sort of simpler or more direct sense, is that this is becoming the rule, not the exception. So the state of exception itself is becoming the rule. And if you look,
meaning it's constant, or just...
meaning it's constant. It's becoming the new paradigm of governance. So it is no longer the exception. And if you look, across jurisdictions, across nations, whether it's at state levels in the US, whether it's there are. I can't remember the thing, but I don't even know if it was him who was putting it. But when I was looking into some of this, there's just thousands of extant states of exception that are happening at local levels, at national levels, and so on.
Yeah.
So there is just a huge amount of, government by decree, which is what which is how the COVID response has been depicted by certain kind of juridical thinkers, but and which basically it undoubtedly is or certainly has been, and so and one of the drivers for that is a kind of risk and crisis based sort of response to the world. It's a kind of securitized response to the world, and in a way it's I guess you can look at it different levels, but this world order, whatever we want to, whether it's the neoliberal world or whatever sort of you want to prefix that with, whatever you see as the kind of driving force of it, is inducing crises, real or created, that are basically meaning that the rule of law is constantly being overridden by exceptional circumstances that then are bringing in what are essentially dictatorial powers.
But doesn't it point to, if that's taking the leap that what Agamben's saying is that is the standard, then that don't just point to it, kind of confirms what a lot of people's suspicion is, that what we've got in the Western democracies is a facade, is people management. It's a great story, because as long as you've always got something, and I think there's more things like the state of exception, as long as you've always got principles to call on in order to negate the threat of the mob. The mob doesn't really have democratic rule if it isn't total. If it can be overridden by the enemies at the gates, whether contrived or otherwise, then it's bollocks, isn't it? It's just a story at that point. And I'm not being extreme about that. I'm just saying it invites that conversation of like where actually is freedom, and where is democratic power, where does it reside when they can just throw it out? Well, it's true until we decide it's not.
Yeah, well, I guess I would sort of, I kind of agree with part of that, but I would dampen that in the sense that,
I thought you would.
Well, in the sense, going back to this consensus, I mean, there's a sense in which, to take the COVID example, that this state of exception is being buttressed or held up by also the manufacturing of consent. I think if that kind of consent or consensus was to break away, and then there's an interesting question with that big other notion, because how many people actually, you hear people all the time saying, oh well, I'm following the rules, I'm not always following the rules, but I don't take the piss or whatever, or like there is that sort of osmosis going on between people, just like, oh well, yeah, it looks like most people are, so I'm kind of but I'm not really, when no one's looking or whatever. I think there's a sense in which, I think that big other's a really good thing for that, because in a way, if not most, many people don't. And when I say don't believe it, I'm not saying they don't believe COVID. They don't believe
this is all kosher and it's not that the threat. The threat justifies
that's the most grand bit. They don't believe that. They don't believe they're at risk, and they don't necessarily believe that they're putting other people at risk to the extent possible.
Because that's what the science says.
Yeah. But yet they do.
It's not a radical position.
But yet there's this sense of, well, what does the big other think? And the media has a huge role in that.
Yeah,
because they're constructing that reality.
That's definitely like my only surprise so far in this. My predictions last January are all fairly on point. We're in the chronology of where I thought we'd be. The one thing that's really surprised me is I thought people would get noisier. I would have thought as time went on, it's a really good metric actually, because I would have thought as time went on, there'd be less and less people. It'd just be like, fuck off, I'm done with this now. And that's not what I see. When we're out wandering around, we're the only people I know that don't wear masks when we're out in public.
But then again, so the mask thing is because, But how many people are out? I mean, we're still supposed to be in lockdown. I mean, the roads are
There's
rammed.
there's
I mean,
but-
people are going.
Oh yeah, no,
all
everyone's
over.
just doing whatever they want. And well, as soon as
So-
they even hinted towards things
So they're
getting
only
softened,
doing it for sort of least, for sort of, what is it, least line of
yeah,
resistance.
but it
or
still
whatever.
it still illustrates that it still illustrates that the amount of people, who are it doesn't illustrate what people believe, but it illustrates what people are inclined to advertise about their position or disinclined to make a firm stand on, right?
Yeah,
And the fact
I think
that if I can walk
disinclined
right,
to make
if there's 200 people in a supermarket and I don't count one without a mask, that is a huge swing from when it was 1 out of every 10 or 15 weren't wearing them.
So disinclined not to advertise, but also, in terms of barriers, as soon as like someone's going to ask you on the way in, and there's going to be social approbation or perceived social approbation around it, plus, albeit the unlikely but nevertheless real threat that the police might find people. They have been doing it. They've been in supermarkets finding people. Put those three things together, that creates a big barrier for most people. And then so that's on one side of the ledger, if you like. Then if you go on to the other side of the ledger, whereby, one of the things I think doesn't get acknowledged sufficiently is that, people are not inclined in general. I mean, it's only people who are, quote unquote, more political, who are inclined to think about
Or just contrarian.
Yeah, contrarian is one thing. That's cats are contrarian. But the sort of political analysis from one direction is that you are. So let's say that maths actually do something like to very marginal effect. I think I don't think anyone's claiming they're like, these like stop the spread. They really.
If someone sneezes in my face, I'd be glad I had a mask on.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
All right, but no, I'm saying the other side. No one's saying okay. No one's saying they're totally useless. But even those people that are, even the kind of scientific. I don't want to call them scientific advice. The public proclamations of what the science says. Mm-hmm. Says, well, yeah, we think they have a bit of an effect. They have a little bit of an effect, so they're worth doing, right? So let's even say that they do have a little bit of an effect. So let's say that some by not doing, you are, increasing the chance in all the sort of stochastic, statistical, blah blah blah, increasing the chance that maybe one person.
But my
whatever.
immediate response would be that'd be easily countered by all the people fucking around with their faces and taking masks off.
Right.
So,
just
for the record.
So I agree. So then there's that's. And then they touch on
And
the
not
point
to
and they
mention
don't actually
starving
make
yourself
them
of
work.
oxygen. I'm not taking that to the conspiracy degree of they're trying to choke us, but I just mean it's a fact that if you even just taking deep breaths every hour is going to radically increase your health. So the quality of the oxygen you're getting it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, but even to stick to the COVID train on that, just because you brought it up, right? As you said, if people are touching them, if they're wearing them in damp climates, if it's raining or whatever,
damp's the key.
then it's potentially actually making it worse.
Makes it worse.
And not only is it making it worse in the sort of direct sense, but people are then having to get closer to talk to people because they can't hear them. They're having to, so it's got some kind of compound effect. And as far as I'm aware, even these sort of associational studies that only seem to come about after this pandemic occurred. The science before that said no, they don't do anything. Mm-hmm. Even this kind of fairly weak, I think, associational science that's come after it has been, as far as I'm aware, in lab conditions. It's not been, all these people wearing it around the chins, pulling it off, getting rained on, like breathing into it, building up moisture and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, right. But all right. But right, let's even just sort of wipe that to one side and say, okay, let's assume we're all living in lab conditions, and let's assume those limited number of studies override, the previous,
decades.
Century, decades certainly of evidence.
Because that's your chap, the Irish chap who you presented to me. That's his position basically. I refuse to look at a year's worth of evidence versus decades and decades of evidence.
But let's assume that's the case. Then,
what's that Irish chap's name again? Just
Ivor Cummins.
Ivor Cummins, that's it. Sorry,
right. So then on the other side of the ledger, you've got what that you are a walking billboard for the big other in this sense. The dominant narrative that this is not only that it's totally exceptional. I admit that the death numbers, and again you could go into a big debate around that, but just excess death is as a percentage increase on the 5-year average extremely high. It happens to be the same as it was in 2003, but you can present these numbers in different ways, and you take different inferences, and I think they're all legitimate ways to present. So I don't know the percentage, but it might not be quite, but it could be up to like 20% increase on the 5-year average. But
hang on, surely we're now into the window, and I'm just playing devil's advocate. Surely we're now into the window of time in which lockdown-based deaths could be significant.
Well, that's the other variable.
I mean, I'm not swinging a bat for that. That seems like the immediate logical.
Well, inevitably, and at one point they were kind of coming up with figures on this, and I'm not sort of rabid on this. They might have done, but I've not come across that, and have tried to look at different points. So what I'm saying is, in the early days, let's say April, June, whatever, they were saying we think there's also been 20,000 excess deaths caused by the lockdowns themselves. There's been no efforts seemingly of late to kind of tally what they think that would be now, but certainly that has to have some effect.
The question that's close to most people's hearts is the lockdown and are the measures justified, right?
Yeah.
And that 20%, I'm guessing that's demographic wise, that's definitely those crosshairs are completely on old and infirm groups. That the policy could have been directed at protecting those groups, and then just getting everyone back to work, right? And if that's still so, and this is why it connects to what you're saying, then no, it's not exceptional. But if those 20% were 18-year-old kids, then it would be exceptional.
I think that's a good point. And so that actually segues into exactly what I was going to say, and as I say, I don't want to kind of get hung up on this part of it, because we're going to have to put a disclaimer. I am not a medical doctor, disclaimer, and I'm not. I mean, I'm only, I mean, there's certain common sense and logic to it, but also, it comes down to, what information are you absorbing, and what do you trust and what don't you trust. But some of these are proof. Some of these are proof facts. I'm saying that 2020 was the same as 2003. I've seen that data, and I'm convinced that's the case. I hope that's not wrong.
As long as that data's checked, I don't think there's anything else that's been affirmed as a certainty, or at least like
no. But so, just the other thing to put next, you said the 18-year-old thing, and whether it's an exception, right? Human civilizations, the human species itself, especially in the world that we live in now, that's interconnected, and where things can more easily spread between people.
Like, everything's changed.
Yeah. But nevertheless, these things are going to periodically happen. They've happened. There was obviously the Spanish flu, which did impact predominantly 18-year-olds. There's been the Hong Kong flu. There's been there's others that I forget the name of. But let's say 3 a century, 4 a century that are big spikes in that way.
And we are a lot. If there was a herd that not needed thinning, but if there was a herd that was ready for thinning.
Oh God,
this is
Dan,
ridiculous.
where are you going with this? This
is
even worse than the dry
Tinder. Are we
7 language. That like herd that needs thinning.
Have we broke 8 billion yet? Like, it was 7.5 billion or something, right? So it's if you would imagine, just purely in evolutionary terms and just looking at the biology, you would expect there to be a fucking catastrophe about this mark of our, with the combination of networking and movement combined with the population size. You would expect to be able to look at history, and the Spanish flu examples where we look back and go, oh, this was a bad one. You would expect, if someone said the worst thing ever that's happened in that way happened in the last 50 years, you'd say, well, of course, this is when you would expect to see it happening. Like, this is when you would expect to see the terrible shit. Yeah. And it's...
And so, the one thing that I thought, and I'm surprised that no one said it, or at least I've not seen anyone said it, and that makes me a little bit suspicious that what I'm saying is somehow kind
Somehow
of
bollocks.
wrong, yeah, bollocks or whatever. But I can't really think how it could be, and it's really quite simple and basic. So I'll try it out on you.
Yeah, always, you're always either really wrong or really right when it does this.
But so comparisons are made, and I've seen stuff whereby, like, obviously the Spanish flu in absolute terms was much worse, like incomparably worse. But in terms of the leap on the 5-year average, it was worse, but it wasn't like massively worse. So, like, when I said this 20% thing, I don't know what it was. It might have been 29%. Whatever it was, it wasn't huge, right? But let's say, and I don't know the exact figures, but we know for sure that life expectancies increased substantially from 1918. So it's around the 80 mark. Maybe it's 84 for women, 82 for men, something like that in the UK. Like, what will it have? Sorry,
or was it?
What
late 50s, early 60s? Like
yeah, in 1918. Like, let's even be generous. Let's say 65, right? If the and so then we just got to compare, right? And so 85 versus 65, right? So imagine, I mean, the Spanish flu affected young people, right? But in general, viruses are going to impact the infirm and the the comorbid, right? So we've now got to a point, we've seen this trajectory of the graph, where we've managed to keep people alive on average up to being 85. Then a virus comes along, and they go, no, it's a 20% increase. It's like, well, yeah, but you can't compare that 20% to a 20% back here. Imagine if COVID came when the life expectancy was 65. It'd be nothing. It'd be a blip, because how many?
And no one said that.
Because
no one's drawn attention.
Not that I've heard. How many under 65s? Well, maybe they think it's distasteful or whatever. But all it's saying is, when they want to compare it with these historical precedents and say that this is unprecedented, like, if we're saying these things come along, let's just say once, 4 times a century, so once every 25 years. Like, you start going back 25 years and look at the life expectancy, then go back another 25 years and look at life expectancy, and then you map, based on the age of people who've died from COVID, or died within 28 days of a positive PCR test. You go back along those 25 years and then start working what percentage of the population would this have been? What impact would it have had on the 5-year average for that period? And I think it would become minuscule. So it's
well, then as well, just to tag onto that, like, it's not like you said about it. Now we've got people. It needs highlighting that it's not just the trajectory of improvement in all-cause mortality. It's that now our medical system literally props up people who in any other biological system on planet Earth would have been gone 5 years ago. Like, you're pounding drugs into people, and not necessarily at an improvement of their life. They're just literally limping on. Yeah. So if there's never been a time in the history of the human race when more human beings were being maintained at death's door. Yeah. Like, with every year that increases. So that's the point I'm making.
So then, if you then bring along these natural things like viruses, albeit ones that operate on timescales that are not like the same as social media and Coronation Street or whatever, they operate on a 25-year or a 50-year time scale. Yes, they seem exceptional, but they're not exceptional, and the fact that we've built all this stuff up. So if we were back in 1918 with the life expectancy of 65 and a virus came on like it did then, that's pretty bad. And if there aren't, the other thing that one always has to go back to when you were saying, like, with the lockdown things, firstly, do they work? Secondly, even if they did, are they justified? And thirdly, it's part of that same question in a way. Are there alternatives that would that would do have a similar efficacy, but not right? But
it's like, are they justified in terms of?
Well, let's say we took, like, the claims of the most sort of rabid proponents of lockdown, and let's take the Imperial College model, that it would have been 500,000 and now it's only 100,000, or if we'd have not done what we've done now, it would have been more. Even still, should there's questions as to to what extent should people's individual liberties be impinged. And kind of my rule of thumb on all of this, and I wouldn't want to totally stand by it in across the board, but people have a sense of threat, like it's not like, if people saw...
If you felt like you were in danger as a result of this situation...
You wouldn't go anywhere. You'd do all this stuff.
I
Like, the
mean,
fact that they've had to try so hard...
There's a class and economic status factor there. Some people would be forced to, even though they couldn't.
Yeah, no, that's true,
But that aside, for most...
No, that's really important and true, yeah. So, and I think it's one of the strongest arguments, that people have made, and it's often this part of the argument comes from the left, obviously, that... people would be forced into the work, and unless the government says, no, we're banning this and we're going to furlough them and all the rest of it, then they would be left. But I'm sure there's more subtle tools of avoiding that than the ones that have been used.
Well, yeah, and just when you think of the amount of money that's been spent even just in the furlough scheme, imagine what initiatives could have been paid
could have
for.
Doubled the capacity of the NHS, yeah. And then, the other things that get me is that, and I do like to tiptoe around some of the science, because I don't want to be kind of making claims that I personally couldn't substantiate and so on. But certain things, like for example the role of vitamin D in this, like the metabolic health, apparently there's plenty of studies that have tried to look at, the effectiveness, what are the key variables that are leading to such disparate sort of, outcomes in different countries. And it seems that,
and there is a correlation with vitamin D, isn't there?
Yeah, it seems so. There's a correlation with vitamin D, a correlation with metabolic health. And there's not only a correlation with vitamin D, they've done some studies now where they've actually, given, massive doses as a treatment at an early stage, and that the outcomes have been phenomenally different.
What are the numbers statistically between like vitamin D deficient nations, like on our latitude versus Australia or whatever?
Yeah, I don't know overall, but there's kind of suspicions that it's sort of affected BAME people more than...
What people?
BAME, Black, Asian and ethnic minority.
Black, Asian, yeah.
There's a socioeconomic aspect to that, that they've been frontline and, blah, 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 undoubtedly. But, one suspicion is, it's well known that
D
deficiencies.
Yeah.
Then you look at kind of, so metabolic health and vitamin D deficiencies. And so they've done studies as well on vitamin D. I think Japan's one that comes to mind, and it was small numbers, so you can't, you can't extrapolate with sort of statistical significance to the population at large. But they followed a small number of Japanese people, and they actually discovered that. I think it was over 50% of them, tested positive for COVID antibodies. So, you can't extrapolate, but let's just say you could, or let's say, there's a huge margin of error. It could be 20, it could be 80 or whatever. The implication that you could draw from that is that it's not that they haven't had COVID, it's just that it hasn't had any impact because, and one of the big things, their metabolic health's, off the scale. And I think the vitamin D levels are high as well. So the point is that I think if you look at this and they're able, to verify some of these things, rather than immediately go into these kind of, vaccinations is the only way or whatever, let's spend all this money on this. Imagine if there was a big campaign from the outset that you need to start taking your vitamin D, you need to doing the exercise, people who are vulnerable to this with comorbidities, of course, not always people can do anything about it. They're too comorbid, they're too old, they've got particular, genetic or whatever illnesses and they can't do that. But imagine if all that effort was put into self-empowerment, fitness, vitamins.
So you mean if all that effort were put into getting people outside and getting sun on the skin and getting exercise, rather than them being locked in houses?
Yeah.
So I'm not.
Or even if you sort of accept the sort of the need for social distancing and whatever these things, at least that would be where we would look in the future. We would be like, how do we avoid this again? We really need to do something about all those nefarious interests that are, we were talking about earlier. Those that are hacking the
Limbic system.
You know, all these things that are basically driving, you know, driving people to unhealthy choices, to choices that are going to make them more vulnerable in the long term to these, you know, to these things. Instead, we're saying like, you know, whatever Boris Johnson was saying, you know, the scientists, you know, with some kind of military metaphor of them coming over the hill with the bugle and like, and basically that we need to kind of, you know, give ourselves over, not only, you know, to that kind of scientific expertise, which is fine, but we you know, it's kind of the Ivan Illich stuff, like, you know, yes, science and knowledge and that sort of stuff is good, but let's do what we can within the kind of sphere of conviviality, within the sphere of like self-help and self-empowerment, and that gives us power and agency.
Yeah, but when the pattern is, not to get conspiracy about it, but the pattern this year is it's all the opposite of that. It's rather than sun on your skin and exercise and metabolic health, it's stay inside. And in fact, going outside of that, the viral load issue, like the idea that it's not just a simple, because that was news to me. Like that's there was a real education. I thought viruses essentially acted like, to use an analogy of a sort of a code that you get that it doesn't matter if one cell gets in or if someone injects you with a syringe full, like you get the virus and you'll respond to it and you'll develop
you'll
immunity.
Reproduce it and it'll grow.
Yeah. Whereas apparently viral load is a big thing. If 3 people in that room have all got it and we all sneeze in your face, you not only are you more likely to get it, but you're going to get a much worse dose of the experience, right? So putting people in houses, I'm not playing the conspiracy card here, but I'm just saying this is what actually eventually this is what did happen, right? Everyone's getting locked in houses with, I mean, you might spot something here that I'm missing, but like being locked in houses, the vitamin D issue there as well. Yeah. But then the fact that if one person in that house has got it, not only are all those people getting it, but and it's hard to isolate from each other, but they're also, unless I'm not, this isn't even on bro science level, but if there's 5 people in a house and one of them's got it, they're all getting it for a start, and then they're all passing it back. They're all keeping that viral load as maximal as possible until they get immunity, and they all recover from it. But what it means is when they're getting it, they're all going to get a much worse case of it. Yeah. So it's weird. It's almost like, what is I'd be interested to know the theory for how we've ended up with an actual set of policies that have been, you couldn't have written a less effective set of policies to minimise harm in the last 12 months.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, I think the thing for me in all of this, because is that actually kind of, you know, empirical science is pretty darn good. It involves, obviously people have hypotheses about things that inform what they do, but that basic kind of principle around trying to construct, you know, control trials, ideally sort of randomized control trials, trying to kind of compare groups with that have taken different trajectories with different characteristics is the only way to do it, because, you know, the intuitive thing is that sort of lockdowns probably would work, you know, at one level, you know, because you're thinking, oh well, you know, yeah, it passes on, but if you keep people in, even in a household, then it's just them, and like we slow down the interaction, we slow down the transmission. But I think there's all sorts of counterintuitive things. There's all sorts of things that you know you can only really find out by doing these kind of tests. So when they, for example, you know, have done these cross-country comparison studies on, you know, lockdown versus no lockdown. You know, there's examples from, I think it's Florida and California. So I think Florida, you know, was quite quickly stopped, and you know, it's well, A, it's in the same continent, same, you know, country, but B, you know, I think there are other, you know, sort of commonalities that make them, you know, good comparisons. And Florida did better than California. California did a strict lockdown. Florida didn't. Like, one thing I've, you know, heard be said, and again, I don't know if this is, you know, someone might listen to this and think, oh, that's nonsense for this reason. But we can go back to the meta in a moment and say, still, that's why it's important to have these conversations.
Exactly. Yeah.
one explanation, one hypothesis got put forward, and they did some modelling, or maybe they even did some empiricism around it. It was that given the age distribution in terms of the negative outcomes from COVID, naturally within a community, within society more generally, the younger populations are more mobile. So what you would expect to happen in the sort of in the development of sort of natural community immunity, herd immunity, is that those that are younger would be more mobile, more interacting, more likely to contract it, and those that are older would be less mobile and therefore less likely to contract it. So you would get a situation where the younger who it impacts less actually then build up protection at a disproportionately rapid pace compared to the elderly. What has lockdown done? It's brought everyone down to the sort of lowest common denominator. So whilst arguably and potentially it slowed down transmission, spread it over a longer period of time, when it came to winter, and this is what some people claim, it actually then meant because the community immunity thing is not an all or nothing. Like, it's like you said, if you're in a room and 3 out of 5 people have immunity, there's all these blockers in the network of transmission. Even if 10% of people do, there's still 10% of blockers in that network, and the bigger it goes up, and then you get to a point where it just can't really spread statistically. There'll be little outbreaks, but it'll quickly dampen because there's no other thing. So there was a paper that was written on this that was kind of making that point and saying we went through a period of summer where actually, potentially for reasons of vitamin D because of the sun, potentially for reasons of people being more outdoor, that even though it was still spreading, it was having next to no impact on mortality. What could have happened then was actually intensive interaction. Everyone be at the football stadiums, everyone be there and there, and it builds up a lot of immunity. You get to winter, and the elderly population are then more protected. Instead, the opposite happened. That was prevented, and then when it comes to winter,
that's a point, right? Like, I can't remember who's. I think it was
Ivor Cummins,
saying right at that moment, that's when we went into the most severe lockdown. Like during that
and that's when they brought in face masks and stuff.
They escalated it.
So but again, this is these are all sort of, I guess, hypotheses until they're proved otherwise. But to sort of draw it back to the meta, the notion that in a short period of time a consensus can emerge whereby something we've not mentioned, but social media platforms can say that unless you're essentially, if you say anything that deviates from the World Health Organization or from national public health bodies, then we're going to take it down. If the media itself, under the state of exception and under the notion of sort of being a strategic support for the government, at least in that respect, playing essentially a state broadcasting role in that context. None of this stuff is adequately being explored, and so all that stuff around the difference between kind of a society that operates under the state of exception under the context of the barbarians at the door. Well, a dictatorial military leader in the context of barbarians at the door might be good. A dictatorial or government by decree in the context of a unknown scientific oriented kind of phenomenon that actually requires that type of openness, essentially open to alternative hypotheses, open to testing of those hypotheses, open to debates on where values lie. In relation to decisions that are going to have multivariant impacts, whether it's mental health, whether it's employment, whether it's employment and livelihoods, whether it's even the fact that elderly people who might have been at risk of dying have ended up dying 2 years later, having spent no time with the family for the last 2 years of their life. Perhaps even those with early onset dementia that have just been completely confused as to why they've not had that physical connection from people that they kind of know and trust. So you know, actually the costs are almost incalculable, and the different value regimes that weigh on even approximating decision making in that have been nullified, silenced, not even open for public debate. You know, I think in a way that it's the last thing that you would want to kind of happen in order to try and kind of navigate your way through. And then the last thing is, I think that then when people are concerned about this, when they see things like this state of emergency, when they know the history like you were talking about, they know that these rights that are given up and these powers that are you know, taken by authorities are very rarely given back, because you know the state, and not necessarily for nefarious or, you know, conspiratorial reasons, if you are an organ that is charged with trying to control situations, you know, in various ways, and not in the not only
well, not
in the
just
sinister
and not
sense
just
of
control,
control,
but capitalize on. Like, there's that whole element of a state doing what a state should do. Well, I mean, should. Even a really optimistic view of how states operate would still allow for it being still allow for a state being remiss in its duties if it didn't seize opportunities to expand its power, especially in relation to neighbouring states. So if something sweeps across the planet, like COVID or anything else like that, and half of the states respond to it by slightly expanding authoritarian control and this, I mean, over a 50-year period, you know, who knows, maybe it's a different kettle of fish. But in the brief 10-year period following that, the market leaders and the people who come out on top of certain industries and all that are all going to be the people who responded fast enough and were able to impose more authoritarian restrictions on the populace or whatever. I mean, it's great, this, because obviously who knows what the effects are of restricting people and how even just of restricting the entire arena of art and entertainment and what, you know, like but immediately in terms of state expansion of power, especially in this era of there being a lot of sort of overseas military interventionist sort of state shenanigans. You could argue, or it could be argued, that a state that didn't use the opportunity to stay a contender among the call it the ecology of oligarchies, if you wanted to be really cynical about what states amount to, if it didn't do that, it's like that's its job. I mean, we would say its job is to serve the citizenry, but one view of the state is that what it's supposed to do is have the amount of the maximum amount of influence it can gain in order to maybe serve its citizenry or serve the state interest, serve the interests overall. So, like, it doesn't have to be a conspiracy, it doesn't have to be pre-planned, it doesn't have to be a virus that gets released. It can just be an organic situation that states respond exactly as you'd expect states to respond when you think that states are constructed from power structures of influential people that would, it's not conspiratorial to suggest that those people would want to secure and expand access to that power.
Yeah, but if you've got a mandate to do something like, you know, I mean, let's take an easier example. Let's take the kind of state security apparatus, right? State security apparatus, and let's just take a very kind of, no need to sort of consider subterfuge or even geopolitics or whatever. Let's just take the most kind of benign and simplistic view, right? That they, if there's a breach of security, right? Let's say there's a terrorist attack and 10 people die. They've got a black mark against them. They've sort of failed. They've not done they've not achieved what they were set out to. What their mandate is, what they were set out to achieve. So if an opportunity arises whereby they think, but of course their operation in normal times is constrained by whatever the view is on the balance between, civil liberties and other legal protections and, the powers or the limitations to the powers that they've got, let's say like, snooping or phone hacking or hacking, or GCHQ stuff, monitoring internet and traffic, or let's just say that, by whatever metric, they are constrained to X degree, and then an event occur, and they believe that by expanding that constraint or removing that constraint, expanding their powers, they would likely be more effective in limiting that occurrence in future.
Yep.
Then an event occurs, and they say, and that event presents an opportunity for them to limit those constraints and or enhance the powers that they've got. Then, even without anything, that's going to happen. But the question for a society is that potentially prevention of a future incident that might kill 10 people worth the effects that those additional powers and those and the removal of those constraints are going to have in all sorts of other directions, be it things that will that exist now or in the future, where they will be thinking, oh well, actually it would be good to know this about the citizen right, so even just the most benign thing, you can kind of say, well, yes, there is an inherent sort of incentive for different agendas or agencies or mandates within the kind of within the sphere of what governments do, for them to sort of pursue those things, but there's and under crisis conditions there's an ability to sort of fuel those or present them in particular ways that then enable those different agencies to gain those additional powers.
Yeah, well, even if you
and I think that's the least, that's the sort of
that's being really subtle about it. Like, if you don't, without even getting fully Project for the New American Century about it,
Yeah.
but but even, let's see what's a fact about that. Isn't that America? It's not a fact that America created that event, right? It's not a fact. I can't say it's a fact anyway, on the basis of the Project for the New American Century.
Yeah.
But it is a fact that a respectable think tank, and a highly influential and respectable think tank, openly stated, look, what we need is this.
Yeah.
Like, it's demonstrated and stated clearly. Yeah. This would be something that would really assist us, right?
Yeah, and let's just be clear. This was a document produced, as you said, by a respected
think tank.
Yeah, amongst neoconservatives, a respected think tank that used the language. What we need is a quote unquote new Pearl Harbor.
Well, it would be based on Brzezinski. When it based on Brzezinski's, I can't remember which book, but I'm not even sure. I might be just pulling this out of my ass, but I think he'd proposed that the New American Century, that America achieving any of its geostrategic aims in the coming era, that it laid out 3 or 4 like key sort of things, and I think he mentioned, I could be pulling this out myself, I'm pretty sure he was the one who highlighted it, and then they were kind of, I don't know how much he's even connected with them, but then they were I think it was fairly central to that document, right? It was that there needs to be a new Pearl Harbor. The exact quote, right?
Yeah. I think it was talking about full spectrum dominance. It was talking about influence and control in the Middle East, and in order to do that, given public sentiment, what would be required would be
a new Pearl Harbor, and
which
this
is
were a few
obviously
years
referring
before 9/11.
Yeah,
This were a few years before 9/11.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they saw this is one of the most dominant things that's put forward as a look what they were saying just before 9/11. But what my point is, regardless of whether that's true, and it's interesting that it happened like that, but it's irrelevant. Like, what I'm saying is, that shows that's within those corridors of power and within those structures, it's taken as read that this is an event, that they would invite an event under those circumstances. So you can apply the exact same thing to COVID, where whether or not there's any subterfuge, it happening, you can be certain that just in terms of sheer statecraft and practical, and maybe even morally, there's something that a moral argument can be made for, but in sheer statecraft, as soon as an event occurs, the state's got to be asking, how do I maximise the benefit of our nation? Whether that's depending on the leaning of the nation, maximising the benefit of the citizens and liberty, or maximising the benefit of our capacity to project military power overseas, or whatever it is. But the first question they're going to ask is going to be, right, how do we respond to this?
Yeah.
And then which state wouldn't be responding predominantly to increase its influence?
Yeah.
I think the answer is none wouldn't.
Yeah. And
that, so you don't need the conspiracy. And I think this to get to us, I think this is why this, it's like, which is the conversation that's worth having? Like, is it worth getting tied up in the weeds with bogged down in the weeds, with banging on about conspiracy and whatever the elements are around it, or what's the effective conversation to be had? It doesn't matter if it was engineered. I mean, there's a different conversation to be had where if it was engineered and released and all the rest of it, that would be an interesting conversation to have in its own right. But for the most effective conversation to have at this point, you could argue that it's not irrelevant, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is we're here, and the reasons why a state might function. Almost everything it's doing, almost everything that the power structure is doing in response to COVID, you can make, at this point, you could make a legitimate argument for that it's the rational, even moral basis under certain circumstances. If you're talking about a dawning multipolar world with all these states jostling for influence and Brexit and everything else going on at the same time, you can argue that there's much bigger things going on than even if it had been a Spanish flu level tragedy, that the majority of states would instantly be saying, well, look, even if this is Spanish flu, that Spanish flu is nothing compared to the divergence we can create here from what our fated reality would have been 5 years from now, based on Brexit or this or that, based on their own opinion. Versus what we can now achieve by, whatever, centralising control, going the way of China, whatever the thing is based on the state. I just think what I'm getting at is I think that is a good arena for people talking about it, because you don't get bogged down in the polarisation then of, well, that's conspiratorial. All right, well, let's not waste the time thinking about whether we're engineered. Let's look at where we're actually fucking at. Look at where we are, look at what the effects of that are, and let's look at what justifications could be either way, because you could end up with a much simpler arena then. Before you start talking about the World Economic Forum and Great Reset and stuff, and then it goes back in the other direction. But
not even there it does, because I think what happened with the sort of New American Century document was that people know there's going to be crises. People know there's going to be crises or events that are relevant to their area of interest. So in their case, it was geopolitics, and it was the ability for America to project military power in a particular region of the world, right? And they know that certain events will provide a context or pretext for that to happen. So you don't need a conspiracy in that respect. And I think the same with the COVID situation. The particular interests. It's just a kind of it's like crisis presents opportunity kind of notion, and it's,
with
so,
the addition of you want your state. You want your state responding to that as well. You want your state responding to that in a way that serves the citizens.
It potentially looks inept and weak. I mean, I would just say
and then creates a power vacuum. Like if you've got states that aren't, that aren't responding properly, it's a weak actor.
Exactly, legitimate concerns of states. They are like in the space of kind of violent extremist groups and so on. One of the ways, because I wanted to say it's not, I don't think we should solely sort of focus on the state and kind of be like, the state as the bad actor, and there are a range of bad actors. There are corporate bad actors that, or if we don't even want to use a value judgment, there are those industries like the digital, like sort of digital security and so on, that are also driving this. They're also kind of like, we've got these technologies, we've developed these tools, we've got these business models, whether it's Amazon, Microsoft, the social media platforms and so on, and we need to seize on this. This is the new normal. We can push further in this direction. We were already in sort of a
Transition.
competition. Yeah, we're already partly in a transition, or we're already in competition with other dominant industries that we were going to usurp. So all of that is being driven forward, and it's anyone. Strategy is driven by context. The context changes. Who are going to be those actors that can kind of seize on that and push it forward? So
yeah, when we're talking about like our narratives emerge, like as soon as you get something, especially on the level of COVID, everyone who can benefit from it goes one way, and everyone who don't, in terms of industry.
Yeah.
Like, so you straight away there you get.
But there's ways all of us could have benefited from it. I mean, there's different narratives that you can attach to this, isn't it?
I have, like, I mean, like, it's not.
But I mean, political narratives. So you could be saying, for example, given I don't want to sort of totally bastardize it now or whatever, but the view that actually we need to sort of reduce scale, that we need to kind of relocalize economies, that we need to kind of have a more direct relationship to our food supply. The narrative could be that globalization, this kind of over interconnectedness, this kind, if it's come from the bat in the Wuhan market, which I think is disputable, but if that's the case, it's to do with the global supply of food chains and like blah 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 blah. So
if you had the money to push your own narrative, if you were the Bond villain now sitting on a pile, you could push the narrative, a massively anti-globalization narrative. Yeah,
not even if you're a Bond villain, just
I mean,
a good one. If civil society was healthy, I mean, like this comes back to what we said before we started this, when you were talking about the environmental stuff. I don't deny. It's not that I'm like, attached to massively the old normal. There's loads of stuff I'd like to change about the old normal. Much of which would be more about kind of more kind of structural and process oriented. In other words, one of the problems is that this crisis, in part, in my view, exaggerated, is going to be the new normal is going to be driven by, in my view, a fairly unhealthy global governance system, which are huge centralized forms of power which cut across sort of state and corporate lines, and increasingly the line between them is hard to draw, and it is that kind of corporatist kind of technocratic governance system that's going to drive that forward. If it was a massively inclusive heterodox civil society that had representatives from all sorts of different kind of interest groups, from labour groups to kind of environmental groups to this and this, and it wasn't, and not labour or environmental groups that are essentially controlled by corporate or state interests, but genuinely sort of autonomous and constituency driven, people driven ultimately, responsive to those activists and kind of mobilizers, from the bottom up, and there was some kind of way in which these different interests would align on a new path forward, then great, a new normal, but when what it actually is, that the centres of influence and the owners of these narratives seem to be emanating from the likes of the World Economic Forum, which is, as far as I can tell, seemingly a site for precisely that kind of corporatist, quote unquote, multi-stakeholder capitalism.
Yeah, and even at the sort of lower level, you get just in lower levels of industry, and even in hospitality and anything else, and even just socially, you can see it right down to individual people. Some people are responding to the crisis in an opportunistic way. I don't mean that in a derisive way. Like, they're looking and going and doing what an intelligent Homo sapien does in order to get ahead for his kids. They're looking at it and going, okay, how can I? The situation is what it is. I'm not going to make it worse, but how can I benefit? And I think probably we'd all do that as long as we weren't hindering anyone or whatever, or being mercenary about it. But that thing of it's been put in a million different terms, but Robert Anton Wilson's really good with the infophilia versus infophobia, that a new novel situation presents itself to you, and you have a bias towards either going, new data, how's it going to fuck me over, versus new data, how can I capitalise on this, right, based on where you are, and basically fear your general sense of, again, limbically oriented kind of, or your limbic orientation, which there's a lot of fear going around. The more fearful you are, you're going to go towards being infophobic versus infophilic. And people now, so even and it's just a weird offshoot of it, but it's even down at the lowest level, the people now who are making moves and 5 years from now are going to be way better off than they were before COVID, are those people who aren't in that fearful state and they're just responding. And that goes all the way up to people just being pretty psychopathic and not giving a fuck about anyone and just trying to capitalize. But it's like that. It's that pattern that seems to repeat. The more humble, the more benign, the more the people who are just looking out for other people's needs are kind of sidelined out of this pecking order. Like you're more likely, just like in a lot of other arenas, if you're looking out for other people, within an economic system that's, or I'd argue, kind of a generally animalistic sort of. Just dog eat dog, like the way that not even just to get down on capitalism, but just the way social structures and Western civilization works. It's not just what's going on with the big movers and shakers up here who may or may not have orchestrated or may not be steering it or whatever the thing is. It's weird how it operates down here as well, in the same way that people who are reactors rather than active actors. There's a huge disparity between who benefits and who doesn't, and it's there's another kind of population control. There's another kind of ostracization of a whole demographic going on there economically. Never mind who it's killing. It's sidelining an entire new subclass.
Yeah, it's having a negative impact on freedom of speech, and it's having an is increasing the power to kind of surveil and track this horrible,
and increasing people's capacity to go along with it, and it making it a lot easier of a sell.
I mean the other thing about the Agamben thing that we didn't mention, so maybe just sort of throw it in here and then maybe we can wrap up for today, but is this notion of bare life, and I think what people are selling, what people are kind of accepting on the basis of the relationship between kind of security and biology, and therefore biosecurity, and that people are kind of willing to give up a set of freedoms and a kind of value regime in a way that's about life in its non-biological sense, about life in its kind of social, political, human, interpersonal, many of those things that would normally have been protected through civil liberties and so on, being sacrificed at the altar of biological life, at the threat that you may die from a virus, and therefore whoever we is, we will protect your biological life, but fundamental things will change about the broader conception of life, the broader set of values, the broader set of freedoms, the broader spheres of human expression and the human experience are going to be curtailed as a result of that, whether that's the kind of indignity of your digital health passport that will undoubtedly expand into a broader form of kind of digital identity, and the different gates and that you will or will not have access to as a result of that. These are the things that seem to be, if you think of, what does COVID mean? I mean, for some people it means a pandemic. I think for other people, and I'd include myself in this, it represents a kind of tipping point or a inflection whereby there's a certain political and social trajectory that's going to be taken, and that by and large, whilst I'm all up for kind of political contestation, and I hope the new normal can get pushed in a particular way, my kind of reading of the runes, my sort of sense of where the political forces and where the power lies at the moment, is that actually it's going to get pushed in a kind of technocratic control direction. You know, it's
Yeah,
kind,
well, you don't-
shrug your shoulders because it's
in-
kind of like, yeah, it goes without saying almost.
in terms of structures capitalizing on events, maybe I might have taken a biased reading of history, but when was the event that was capitalized on in a positive sense? Like I'd even disregard the 60s and sort of civil rights movement. Do you know what I mean? When you zoom out from it and you look at the overall effects of a lot of different things, like when was there an era where a huge crisis was capitalized upon by the people and liberty in general?
Well, it must have been. Otherwise, we wouldn't have gone from monarchical.
No, I'd say other than sort of revolution, like it's usually incremental. It's usually just people slowly by increments saying, "I'm not going to fucking do that," you know. And yeah, usually that culminates in some sort of a climax and some revolution. Obviously, yeah, like you're saying, there's some drama at the end point, but whenever there's something like this, yeah, because the thing is, it stands to reason that in a crisis, the people who are primed to respond are the people who either knew about the crisis, or were waiting for a crisis. And
Yeah.
you know that generally speaking, the liberties of freedom-loving individuals,
Yeah,
people
and that's
aren't
the state of
we're not fired up
exception
and ready to
argument. Yeah. I think that's the basic lesson of the state of exception. I think, and I think for the we lived through probably in the sort of prime of our kind of political maturity, or the 9/11 thing. And I remember saying at the start of this, it felt like there'd been a big swindle going on. It felt, after 9/11, I think, kind of, I wasn't actually sort of aware at the time, but I think I sort of became aware, in the years after that, in terms of how, paradigm had shifted, or, Rubicon had been
became
crossed.
acceptable.
Yeah.
What became
And that had happened in the blink of an eye, when people were whipped up into hysteria. Like, yes, the kind of, again, the event, the drama of that event, the mediation of that event, the kind of, I can't think of the word, but almost like the Hollywoodization of that event, the spectacle. That's
mythologization.
The mythologization and the spectacle of that event drove through, fundamental changes. And at the time, people basically, the lawmakers themselves, whether it's in Congress or whether it was in Parliament, kind of just acting in a period of kind of panic and hysteria and so on, under the weight of that, the power of that myth, the power of that narrative, the power of that spectacle, and it just it seems difficult to. It seems difficult for anyone to be able to look back and say, oh yeah, that was proportionate and necessary. How many people in the US, in the UK, die as a result of terrorism?